Hey guys, okay, so we're going to talk about 4.3, finding complex solutions of quadratic equations. So there's a couple ways we can do this. First, we're going to talk about completing the square. So that's what 4.3 is all about. We're going to talk about how to complete the square for a quadratic equation. Typically you see a quadratic equation and it's like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. In this, we're going to actually subtract that c from both sides. And we're going to have c on the right side of the equal sign. So here's the form. Here's the, here's the form, x squared plus bx equals c. And then we're going to identify our b, okay? We're going to identify whatever this coefficient here for this term is. And we're going to write it as b over 2 squared. And we're going to add that to each side. So what this does, what this gives us, it's called a perfect square trinomial. A perfect square trinomial. And it factors to this, which means the left side of our equation here, after we complete the square and add this b over 2 squared to that side, we get to factor into this one component. And then we'll deal with the c plus b over 2 squared after we factor it. I'll show you what I mean in an example here. So here's our example. We've got this equation, and it's in this form, right? It's in this typical form, which means we need to move that c to the other side of our equal sign. So step one, we need to rewrite in this form, right? So we need to rewrite it in this form, which moves that c to the other side. So here we've got that. We've moved our c to the other side. Okay. Step two, we need to identify what this guy is, our b over 2 squared. We need to figure out what the heck that is. Well, this is our b, right? So that means that, here I'll just kind of do this as we go along. So that means that our b over 2 squared, well, our b is 8, right? So 8 over 2 squared. Okay, well, 8 divided by 2 is 4. So 4 squared, well, 4 squared is 16, right? No, 16. So 16 here, that is our b over 2 squared. So that's our important piece that we're going to add to both sides of our equation. So here, our step three, we need to add this guy, which was 16, to both sides. So we add plus b over 2 squared plus b over 2 squared. There we go. So now we've got x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals negative 17 plus 16. Okay. The reason that we went through all this trouble, remember, is because we got, now we have a perfect square trinomial on this side of the equal sign, which we can factor to x plus b over 2 squared. Now remember our b over 2 is just this component here, right? This in the middle, which is 4. So b over 2 is 4. So that's what we've got in here. So x plus 4 squared. And then we've got negative 17 plus 16 over here. Well, that's just negative 1. There we go. So that's why we went through all that trouble, so that we can break this down into something that we can work with. And that was step 4. Okay, so step 5, we need to solve for our x, right? Since we've got x plus 4 squared, we need to get rid of the squared, which means we take the square root of both sides. We've got the square root of negative 1, which we discovered in our last lesson. We know that the square root of negative 1 equals, call that I. So x plus 4 equals the square root of negative 1. X, and then we subtract 4 from both sides. So x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 1. We know that the square root of negative 1 is I. So we just replace that at the end. So we've got negative 4 plus or minus I. So just take your homework questions, apply these steps to them. Okay, it takes a little getting used to, but I think you guys will be fine. If you have any questions, let me know. Let's do one more example and talk about the discriminant. So here's an example that I kind of did quickly. I went through all the steps, but I just kind of did it all at once to show you what that looks like. So here's the equation that we're starting with. Our first step, we need to move this C over to the other side of the equal sign. So that gives us x squared plus 10x equals 7. Now we need to identify our b over 2 squared. Our b is 10, right? There's our b. 10 over 2, well, that's 5. So our b over 2 equals 5. And our b over 2 squared is 5 squared, which is 25. Great. So here's our two magic numbers. This 25 is what we're going to add on both sides here. That's what got put in right here. We're going to add our b over 2 squared to each side of our equation. So that gives us our perfect square trinomial right here, which we can factor, right? Remember that that perfect square trinomial can factor into x plus and we know that b over 2 is 5, so that's where we got this guy right here. So we were able to factor this perfect square trinomial into x plus 5 squared. Okay, so now we're solving for x, right? We've got to get rid of this squared, so we take the square root of both sides, and when we do this side, 7 plus 25 is the square root of 32. So we've got x plus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 32. We can break 32 down into 16 times 2. We did that because 16 is a perfect square. We can pull that out. The square root of 16 is 4. So the 4 comes out. The 2 stays underneath because the square root of 2, it's not a perfect square. So it's so we've got plus or minus 4 times the square root of 2. We've got one more step left. We need to subtract 5 from both sides. And that gives us our final answer. X equals negative 5 plus or minus 4 times the square root of 2. So the most trouble that you guys are going to have probably is going to be dealing with these square roots. Remember, you find factors that are perfect squares so that we can pull that out. We found a 16. 16 is a factor of 32. And we use 16 because it is a perfect square. The square root of 16 is 4. I think that's what may trip you up the most. Little practice. And again, these homework are not long. I think you'll be able to get through it. So follow the steps. Follow the steps. And I think you'll be all right. Okay, let's talk about the discriminant real quick. So you know, here's the quadratic formula, right? X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Well, this component here, I wonder what this does. Oh, okay, it makes it orange. That's cool. Okay, so this piece that's under the square root sign, that's an important piece of the quadratic formula. It's called the discriminant. The discriminant tells us how many real solutions an equation has. So when we find our A, B, and C, right? Remember, those are going to be the coefficients. So like AX squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So here's our a, here's our b, here's our c. And we can take those and apply them to just the discriminant here, just this part under the square root sign, this b squared minus 4ac. And then depending on what we get when we substitute in these pieces, will tell us how many real solutions we have for our quadratic equation. So if after we plug all that stuff in, it's greater than 0, then there are 2 real solutions. If after we plug everything in, it's less than 0, there's 0 real solutions. And if after we plug everything in, it equals 0, then there's 1 real solution. So let's take a look at a couple of examples that talk about figuring out the discriminant and then using it to figure out how many real solutions we have. So here's the equation that we're starting with, right? Here's my A, here's my B, and here's my C. So remember, the discriminant is just the piece under the square root sign. So b squared minus 4ac. We're going to plug our A, B, and C into their spots for our discriminant. So b is 9, so 9 squared minus 4 times a, which is 3, times c, which is negative 6. Okay, so negative 4 times 3 is negative 12, times negative 6, 9 squared is 81. 81, or negative 12 times negative, or 12 times negative 6, that gives us negative 72. Okay, so 81 minus 72 is 9. 9 is greater than 0. So we've got 2 real solutions. We've got 2 real solutions. Okay, bud, I'm coming. Okay, so let's look at this, our second example down here. Here's our A, here's our B, here's our C. So when we input those into our discriminant, we've got B squared, which is 4 squared, minus 4 times A times C. 4 times 2 is 16, and 4 squared is 16. So 16 minus 16 is 0. And we know that if our discriminant equals 0, then that means there is 1 real solution. These aren't super complicated. Identify your A, B, and C. Input them into your discriminant, your b squared minus 4 times a times c, and then just solve. And that solution, whether it's greater than 0, less than 0, or equals 0, will tell you how many real solutions you have in your equation. Okay, so discriminant, follow these steps, figure out how many real solutions you have, and then finding complex solutions, complete the square, identify your b over 2 squared, add to both sides, factor, solve. There you go. I think you guys will be okay. If you have any questions, please let me know. All right, talk to y'all later.